It was a normal bike ride until the cyclist was never found again. The first thing was the sound, or the lack of it. A profound and sudden silence where there should have been the whisper of rubber on asphalt. The rhythmic puff of a cyclist's breath. Sarah pulled her own bike to a stop, the crunch of gravel under her tires unnaturally loud in the dead air of the late afternoon. The sun, a fat orange globe, was beginning to dip below the crest of the rolling Virginia hills, painting the undersides of the clouds in violent shades of purple and rose. It was the golden hour, the time of day every photographer and cyclist cherishes, when the world softens and glows from within. But the light today felt different. It felt accusatory. Her gaze swept the empty stretch of Old Weaver Road. It was a ribbon of cracked pavement winding through an endless tapestry of dense dark woods and overgrown fields. The kind of road that made you feel like you were the last person on earth. She was, or at least, it felt that way. Leo should have been just ahead of her. He was always just ahead of her, his powerful legs pumping a steady metronomic rhythm she'd come to rely on as the soundtrack of their weekend rides. He was stronger, faster, a human machine built of sinew and determination. He'd crested this very hill no more than 2 minutes before her, a flash of his obnoxious canary yellow jersey disappearing over the rise. She'd cursed him goodness, her lungs burning, and pushed harder. But now, there was nothing. No flash of yellow. No receding silhouette. Just the empty road, the whispering trees, and a silence that was beginning to feel like a physical presence, pressing in on her from all sides. A deer, maybe. A sudden swerve. Her heart began to thrum, a nervous off-key rhythm against her ribs. "Leo," she called out, her voice thin and reedy in the vast emptiness. The sound was swallowed by the trees before it had a chance to travel. She clicked her shoes out of her pedals and started walking, pushing her bike. The worry of its freewheel, a frantic, insect-like sound that did nothing to soothe her nerves. Then she saw it. It was lying on its side, halfway in a shallow, weed ditch. Leo's bike. A pristine carbon fiber marvel of engineering that cost more than her first car. It was his baby, a thing he cleaned with neurotic precision after every ride. Now, it lay there like a broken bird, its frame gleaming under the dying sun, one pedal pointing accusingly at the sky. The front wheel was still spinning, a slow, lazy, hypnotic rotation that seemed to be counting down the final seconds of a world that had made sense only moments before. The spinning was what broke the dam of her composure. A bike doesn't just fall and keep spinning like that. Not for this long. It was a sign of recent, violent energy, an abrupt stop. "Leo," her voice was sharper now, a shard of panic in it. She dropped her own bike carelessly onto the grassy shoulder and scrambled down into the ditch. The air was thick with the sweet, cloying smell of honeysuckle and something else, something metallic and wrong. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the frame of his bike. It was cold to the touch. She scanned the ground, her eyes darting everywhere at once, searching for a sign, any sign, a scuff mark, a broken branch. Blood dot there, tangled in the spokes of the still spinning front wheel, was a single, long strand of something that didn't belong. It was coarse, almost like twine, but dark and matted. She looked closer, her stomach clenching into a tight, icy knot. It was hair, not Leo's. It was too long, too thick, and it was caked with something dark and dry. She looked at the ground, beneath the pedal, and saw a small, dark patch in the dirt, almost black in the fading light. It was still damp. She didn't need to touch it to know what it was. The coppery scent, faint but unmistakable, hit the back of her throat. And she gagged, stumbling backward, away from the bike. Away from the spinning wheel and the silent story it was telling. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. This wasn't a crash. This was a scene, an alteration, a violation. The beautiful, peaceful road had transformed into a place of menace. The woods were no longer just trees. They were a wall of silent, watching eyes. The setting sun wasn't beautiful. It was a bloody wound in the sky. Power imbalance. The phrase slammed into her mind from some forgotten psychology lecture. Leo, so strong, so in control on his bike, a master of his own physical world. And then, something else, something stronger, something that could stop a man like him in an instant, pluck him from his life as easily as a hawk plucks a mouse from a field. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers so numb and clumsy she could barely unlock it. The screen glared at her, an alien light in the encroaching dusk. No service, of course. Old Weaver Road was a dead zone, a place where the modern world hadn't quite managed to penetrate. That was part of its charm. Now, it was part of its horror. She was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone with this evidence. A sound cut through the air, sharp and close. The crack of a twig from the woods, just beyond the ditch. Sarah froze, her blood turning to ice water in her veins. She wasn't alone. Her head snapped toward the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could see nothing but a wall of impenetrable shadow, the trees merging into a single dark mass. But she could feel it. A presence, a weight in the air. The feeling of being watched. "Who's there?" she whispered, the words barely audible. The silence that answered was heavier, more profound than before. It was a listening silence, an intelligent silence. The injustice of it all crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow, the unfairness, the sheer random cruelty. 1 minute, a man is riding his bike, lost in the simple joy of movement and exertion. The next, he is gone, vanished, erased, and all that is left is a spinning wheel and a single damning strand of hair. She had to get out of there now. She scrambled back up the embankment, grabbing her bike, not daring to look back at the woods. Her hands shook so violently she could barely grip the handlebars. She swung her leg over the frame, her movements clumsy and panicked. She had to get to a place with a signal. She had to call for help. She had to tell someone what she had found. But as she stood there, straddling her bike, ready to flee, her eyes fell on one last thing. Something she hadn't noticed before. Lying in the grass near where Leo's bike had been, almost hidden by a clump of dandelions, was his water bottle. It had been ejected in the fall, she assumed. But it wasn't the bottle that made her breath catch in her throat. It was what was next to it. A small handcrafted object. A little doll, no bigger than her hand, woven from dried corn husks. It had button eyes, sewn on with black thread, and a crude, stitched mouth, turned down in a permanent frown. And pinned to its chest, with a rusty nail, was a small folded piece of paper. Her fear was a living thing. A cold serpent coiling in her gut, but a stronger, more desperate impulse took over. The need to know. She let her bike fall again, and crept toward the doll, her feet moving as if through deep water. With a trembling hand, she reached down and pulled the nail free. The paper was old and brittle, and it crackled as she unfolded it. There was a single word written on it, in a spidery, childish scrawl. The ink was faded, brown with age, bond-mined. The cliffhanger wasn't a cliffhanger. It was a chasm. It was the bottom falling out of the world. The word hung in the air, a final, possessive whisper in the terrifying silence. It wasn't a clue. It was a claim. A statement of ownership. Leo wasn't just missing. He had been taken. He had been harvested. The spinning wheel on his bike finally wobbled to a stop, and in the absolute crushing stillness that followed, Sarah knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he was never coming back. And as the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the hills, plunging the world into a deep, starless twilight, she heard the sound again. Closer this time, the soft, deliberate tread of footsteps, approaching from the darkness behind her. She didn't scream. The sound was trapped in her throat, a solid ball of ice. She could only stand there, paralyzed, clutching the impossible, terrifying message in her hand, waiting for the owner to come and claim his property. The injustice wasn't just that Leo was gone. It was that his story was already being rewritten by someone else, a story that ended with a corn-husk doll and a single possessive word that staked a claim not just on his life, but on his very memory. And she was the only one who knew. She was the one who had to carry the truth, and the terror that came with it, back into a world that would never believe her. The power was not in her hands. It was in the hands of the person who had left this doll, this totem of a private, brutal ritual. It was in the hands of the footsteps that were now just feet away from her. A dark shape detaching itself from the deeper darkness of the woods. The shock wasn't just emotional, it was primal. It was the ancient, terrifying realization of the prey in the presence of the predator. And the hunt, she knew with a sickening finality, had only just begun. The cliffhanger was her own life, hanging by the thinnest of threads, as a low voice, rough as gravel and ancient as the hills, finally broke the silence. "You shouldn't have seen that." Leo wasn't a saint. That was the first thing his wife, Clara, told the deputy who showed up at their door 3 hours after Sarah, hysterical and incoherent, had finally found a pocket of cell service and called 911. The deputy, a young man, with a face that hadn't yet settled into the permanent suspicion of his profession, had jotted it down in his little notebook. Not a saint. A strange thing to say about your missing husband, but Clara had always been ruthlessly, painfully honest. It was the bedrock of their marriage, a pact they'd made over a cheap bottle of wine 12 years earlier. After they'd both confessed the messy, broken parts of their pasts. No more secrets, they'd sworn. No more lies. Leo's broken past was a kaleidoscope of bad decisions and narrowly avoided disasters. He'd been a ghost in his own life for the better part of his 20s, drifting from one dead-end job to another, fueled by a quiet, desperate rage he couldn't name and a thirst for the cheap oblivion found at the bottom of a bottle. He'd woken up in gutters, in strangers' beds, in the sterile quiet of a hospital emergency room with a vague memory of flashing lights and the taste of blood in his mouth. He was chasing something, or running from something. He was never quite sure which. The anger was a constant companion, a low hum beneath the surface of his skin. It was an inheritance, passed down from a father who spoke with his fists, and a mother who had perfected the art of silent, resentful endurance. He'd been a boy who learned to make himself small, to disappear into the wallpaper, and a man who was terrified of being invisible. Cycling had saved him. Clara had bought him that first bike, a heavy, second-hand Schwinn, hoping it would give him something to do other than stare at the bottom of a glass, and it had worked. The rage, the restless energy, found an outlet. He poured all his frustration, all his self-loathing, into the pedals. He rode for hours, punishing himself, pushing his body to its absolute limit, until the only thing he could feel was the clean, simple ache of exhausted muscles and the cool rush of air on his sweat-soaked skin. He was chasing a feeling, not an escape. He was chasing the burn in his lungs, the fire in his thighs, the singular focus that silenced the angry ghosts in his head. The bike became his confessional, his therapist, his church. He traded the bar for the open road, the burn of whiskey for the burn of lactic acid. He got sober. He got a steady job as a graphic designer. He married Clara. He built a life, a real one, piece by painstaking piece, as if assembling one of the high-end carbon frames he'd eventually come to covet. He was still angry. Sometimes he still had a darkness in him, a shadow that flickered in his eyes when he was tired or stressed, but he was fighting it. He was winning. He wasn't a saint, no. But he was a man who was trying, with every fiber of his being, to be good. The man tasked with finding him was Sheriff Al Brody. He arrived at the scene on Old Weaver Road, long after the sun had set. His presence sucking the air out of the small circle of flashing blue and red lights. Brody was a man carved from the local granite. His face a roadmap of weathered lines, his gut straining against the buttons of his starched brown uniform. He moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who had ruled this small county for 30 years, his authority as absolute and unquestioned as the changing of the seasons. He'd inherited the badge from his father, and his father from his Brodys, were as much a part of Buckingham County as the red clay soil and the whispering pines. Brody's past wasn't just broken, it was shattered, and the pieces had been swept under the rug of local history, a place where secrets were kept like family heirlooms. 20 years earlier, a teenage boy had gone missing in these same woods. A tourist's son, A massive search had been launched, state police and canine units swarming the county. Brody, then a young, ambitious deputy, had been at the center of it. The boy was never found, but whispers had followed Brody ever since. Whispers about a botched investigation. A key witness who had suddenly recanted their statement. A story that never quite added up. The official report said the boy had gotten lost, a tragic accident, but the old-timers knew better. They spoke in hushed tones about the Brody family's temper, their possessiveness over their land, their deep-seated resentment of outsiders. The incident had almost cost Brody his career, but his father, the then Rev, had smoothed things over, pulled some strings, and the whole thing had been quietly buried. Buried, but not forgotten. The failure had festered in Brody, curdling his ambition into a bitter, simmering resentment. He hated outsiders, he hated complications, and he hated anything that threatened the fragile peace of his carefully controlled kingdom. Leo, the city dweller, with his expensive bike and his canary yellow jersey, was an outsider. A complication. Brody listened to Sarah's frantic, tearful account with a look of profound boredom, his eyes cold and dismissive. He picked up the cornhusk doll with two thick fingers, holding it as if it were a piece of roadside trash. Probably some kid's nonsense, he'd grunted, his voice a low rumble. Folks around here, they have their little traditions. He tossed it into an evidence bag with a careless flick of his wrist. He looked at Leo's abandoned bike, the pristine frame now coated in a fine layer of forensic dust. Man probably had a heart attack, he declared, to no one in particular. Or maybe he just took off. You say he had a past. People with pasts, they tend to repeat them. He was already writing the story, crafting a narrative of convenience. A story that required minimal effort and no uncomfortable questions. A story that would keep the old ghosts buried. And then there was the witness. The one hidden in plain sight. Her name was Jenna May Collins, and she was 17 years old. She lived in a ramshackle farmhouse that stood on a rise overlooking Old Weaver Road, a paint-peeled two-story box of rotting wood and broken dreams. From her bedroom window, she had a perfect, unobstructed view of the exact spot where Leo's bike had been found. She had been sitting at that window when the man in the yellow shirt had cycled past, his head down, a picture of focused determination. She had watched him for a moment, a fleeting pang of something like envy twisting in her gut. He was moving, he was going somewhere, she was not. Jenna's world was a cage, and her father, Earl, was the warden. Earl was a man hollowed out by resentment and cheap liquor, his days measured in the empty cans that littered the porch. His love for his daughter was a twisted, possessive thing, a suffocating blanket of control. Jenna was his property, his last remaining possession in a life of failures. Her mother had run off years ago, and Earl had never forgiven her, or the daughter she'd left behind. Jenna's life was a litany of chores, of Earl's drunken, rambling monologues, of the constant low-level fear of his temper, which could flare into violence with no warning. Her only escape was her phone, a cheap crack-screen device she guarded like a state secret. It was her window to a world beyond the farm, a world of friends she'd never met and places she'd never see. On that afternoon, she hadn't been watching the road. She'd been watching her father. He was in the yard below her window, arguing with another man. A man in a pickup truck, a rusty Ford that was as familiar a sight in their driveway as the weeds that grew in the cracks. The man was their landlord, Mr. Abernathy, a person of consequence in the county. A man who owned half the land and, it was said, the other half of the people. The argument was about rent. It was always about rent. But this time, it felt different. Earl's voice was high and thin with desperation. Abernathy's was a low guttural threat. Jenna, hidden behind her curtains, had started recording on her phone. A habit she'd developed out of self-preservation. She recorded Earl's rages, his drunken promises, his threats. It was her insurance policy, a collection of digital evidence that one day, she might be brave enough to use to escape. She'd been focused on the screen, her thumb hovering over the stop button when the flash of yellow had entered the frame. She saw Leo ride past on the road in the background of her video. She saw the old, familiar pickup truck that was always parked under the trees down by the creek, the one nobody ever claimed. She saw the truck's door swing open. She saw two men get out. They were local boys, men she recognized but didn't know. The kind of men who lingered in the shadows of the county, doing the dirty work for powerful people. And then, she saw the truck pull out onto the road, fast, cutting off the cyclist. It happened so quickly, a blur of motion. The man in yellow disappeared behind the truck. The truck stopped for a moment, then sped away, turning down a dirt track that led deep into Abernathy's vast, wooded property. Then, silence. Jenna had stopped recording, her heart pounding. She knew what she had seen. She knew who the men were. She knew whose truck it was, and she knew whose land they had disappeared onto. She sat there, frozen. The video, a toxic secret, burning on her phone. Minutes later, she saw Sarah's bike crest the hill. She watched the woman find the abandoned bike, her panic a distant, silent movie playing out through the dirty glass of her window. She saw her find the doll, and then she saw Sheriff Brody arrive. She watched him walk the scene, his movements slow and deliberate. She watched him talk to Mr. Abernathy, who had mysteriously reappeared at the edge of the woods. They hadn't shaken hands. They hadn't needed to. It was a meeting of kings in their shared kingdom. A quiet confirmation, an understanding. Jenna knew then that she was trapped. She was a witness to a crime that, officially, had never happened. The victim was a man nobody knew. The antagonist was the most powerful man in the county. And the only evidence was on a cracked phone belonging to a girl whose father would sooner sell her soul than let her speak. A word against the man who held the deed to their miserable lives. Her secret was not a key. It was a weight, dragging her down into the same dark, silent soil where so many other secrets in this county were buried. She was the hidden witness, and her silence was the price of her survival. The injustice wasn't just Leo's disappearance, it was the conspiracy of silence that had swallowed him whole, a silence held in place by decades of fear, corruption, and the unwritten laws of a land that protected its own, above all else. And Jenna, from her lonely window, was its newest, most terrified guardian. The search, if it could be called that, was a joke. It was a performance for the benefit of the local news channel from Roanoke, a piece of political theater directed by Sheriff Brody. For 2 days, a handful of unenthusiastic volunteer firefighters in clean, crisp uniforms half-heartedly beat the bushes along a 1-mile stretch of Old Weaver Road. Their movements slow and lethargic, their faces etched with a profound lack of urgency. They were Brody's men, their loyalty absolute, their questions non-existent. They found nothing. No footprints, no scraps of clothing, no blood trail. It was as if Leo had simply evaporated into the humid Virginia air. Brody held a press conference on the 3rd day. Standing in front of the county courthouse, the picture of solemn, beleaguered authority. He spoke in platitudes, his voice a gravelly baritone of practiced sympathy. "We're exploring all possibilities," he said, squinting into the glare of the single camera. Mr. Vance had a history of personal challenges. It's not uncommon in these cases for an individual to simply walk away, to seek a new start. He let the insinuation hang in the air, a poisoned dart aimed squarely at Leo's memory. He was painting a portrait of a troubled man, a flight risk, a man whose disappearance was his own damn fault. He was giving the public an easy answer, a convenient box to put their fleeting curiosity in before they moved on to the next headline. Clara watched the press conference on her laptop, a scream of pure impotent rage building in her chest. Walk away. Leo wouldn't walk away, he would fight. He would claw and scratch and bite and do whatever it took to get back to her, back to the life he had fought so hard to build. This narrative, this casual, cruel dismissal of her husband, was a second violence, an assault on his character. She called Brody's office 12 times a day. At first, he took her calls, his tone one of weary condescension. "Mrs. Vance, we have the best men on it. You have to be patient." Then, His patience wore thin. Clara, he'd snapped. The false familiarity, a deliberate insult. Your husband is not the only thing on my plate. We're doing what we can. Now, I suggest you let us do our jobs. The final call ended with him hanging up on her. The message was clear. Go away, be quiet. Your pain is an inconvenience. The betrayal felt like a physical blow. The system that was supposed to help her was actively working against her, building a wall of indifference and bureaucracy around her husband's memory. She felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her friends and family offered sympathy and casseroles. Their eyes filled with a pity that felt more like a dismissal. They wanted her to grieve, to accept, to move on. They didn't want to hear about the inconsistencies, about the spinning wheel, about Sarah's gut-wrenching certainty that something was deeply wrong. They didn't want to hear about the cornhusk doll. The doll. It sat in an evidence bag on a shelf in Brody's office, labeled, and forgotten. But for Clara, it was a symbol of the truth, a tiny, terrifying artifact from a world of violence that had intersected with hers. She had researched it online, late at night, when the house was too quiet and sleep was an impossibility. She'd found forums on Appalachian folklore, on mountain traditions, on the strange, syncretic beliefs that lingered in the isolated pockets of the Blue Ridge. The dolls were sometimes used as puppets, as warnings, as markers of a claim. Mine. The word echoed in her mind, a chilling declaration of a brutal, primitive power. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was personal. It was possessive. The injustice was a suffocating weight. Brody's cruelty grew bolder. He began to leak details of Leo's past to the local paper. Not the story of his recovery, but a carefully curated list of his failures. A DUI from 15 years ago, a disorderly conduct charge. He was turning Leo into a caricature, a ghost. With a rap sheet, making it easier for people to believe he deserved whatever had happened to him. He was salting the earth of Leo's reputation, ensuring that no seed of doubt in the official story could ever take root. Meanwhile, in the peeling farmhouse on the hill, Jenna was living in a prison of fear. The video on her phone was a ticking time bomb. Every time a car crunched up their gravel driveway, her heart leaped into her throat. Every time her father, Earl, looked at her with his bloodshot suspicious eyes, she felt a cold sweat prickle her skin. She knew he was meeting with Abernathy. She saw the man's expensive truck idling at the end of their lane more and more frequently. She saw Earl come back from these meetings with a fresh bottle of whiskey and a wad of cash that he'd stash in a loose floorboard under his bed. He was being paid for his silence, and, by extension, for hers. Her conscience was a raw open wound. She saw Leo's face in her dreams, the focused determination as he cycled past her window. A man in the last moments of his life. She saw Clara's face on the news, her eyes wide with a pain and desperation that Jenna understood on a cellular level. She was a girl, trapped by a powerful, abusive man. Clara was a woman trapped by one. They were mirror images of each other, their lives orbiting the same dark center of gravity. The escalating conflict became terrifyingly personal, one hot, sticky afternoon. Sheriff Brody's cruiser pulled into her driveway. Jenna was on the porch, shelling peas, her hands moving automatically while her mind raced. Brody got out of the car, moving with that same slow, deliberate pace. He wasn't here on official business. He wasn't wearing his hat. This was a social call, a warning. Jenna. May, he said, his voice a deceptively gentle rumble. He sat on the porch swing, which groaned in protest. Your daddy tells me you're a good girl, quiet. Mind's her own business. He looked out at the road, at the spot where Leo had vanished. It's a good quality in a young woman. Discretion. He picked up a pea pod from her bowl and split it. With his thick thumbnail. See, this world is full of things that are best left unseen. Things that are complicated. You understand complications, don't you, Jenna May? Jenna could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. Her phone was in her pocket, a heavy, incriminating weight. Did he know? Was this a guess? A shot in the dark? People from the city, Brody continued, his gaze still fixed on the road. They don't understand our ways. They come out here with their fancy toys and their loud clothes, and they don't show the proper respect. They get into trouble. It's a sad thing, but it's the way of the world." He turned his head and looked directly at her, his eyes like two chips of blue ice. A smart girl, a girl who wants to have a nice, long, peaceful life, she learns to look the other way. She learns to forget what she might have seen, or what she thinks she might have seen. He stood up, his knees cracking. "You're a smart girl, aren't you, Jenna May?" It wasn't a question. It was a command. It was a threat, wrapped in the guise of fatherly advice. The power he held over her was absolute. He was the law. He was the friend of the man who owned their house, their land, their lives. He was the man who could make her, and her father, disappear as easily as Leo Vance had. He smiled, a thin, cruel line in his weathered face. "You have a good day now." As his cruiser disappeared down the road, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake, Jenna ran inside, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the bowl of peas. She locked herself in the bathroom, her breath coming in ragged sobs. The fear was a physical thing, a cold hand squeezing her heart. But underneath the fear, something else was beginning to spark, a tiny, hard kernel of rage. The injustice of it all. The humiliation, the way Brody had looked at her, the way he had spoken to her, as if she were a stupid animal to be tamed. He was so sure of himself, so confident in her fear, in her silence. He had underestimated her. They all had. The struggle between her fear and her conscience was no longer a struggle. The fear was still there, cold and sharp, but the conscience was burning hotter. It was no longer just about a stranger in a yellow shirt. It was about her. It was about the cage she was in. And for the first time, she realized the video in her pocket wasn't a weight dragging her down. It was a key. A dangerous, terrifying key, but a key nonetheless. And she was going to have to find the courage to use it. The tension wasn't just rising. It was becoming unbearable. A pressure cooker with the heat turned all the way up, and Jenna knew, with a terrifying certainty, that something was about to explode. The breaking point came on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after Leo vanished. It came not with a bang, but with the quiet, sickening click of a bedroom door lock. Earl had been on a 4-day bender, fueled by Abernathy's hush money. The whiskey had finally run out, and the shaking had started, followed by the paranoia. He'd cornered Jenna in the kitchen, his eyes wild and red-rimmed, his breath a foul mix of stale liquor and sour regret. He'd accused her of plotting against him, of trying to call her mother, of wanting to run away and leave him to rot. He'd grabbed her phone, his thick fingers fumbling with the screen, demanding to see who she'd been talking to. It was the moment she had been dreading. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength she didn't know she possessed, she'd ripped the phone from his grasp, shoved him backward, and fled to her room, slamming the door and twisting the flimsy lock just as his heavy body thudded against it. He raged for an hour, his fists pounding on the thin wood, his voice a slurred torrent of threats and accusations, and then, silence. A silence, more terrifying than the noise. Jenna sat on her bed, her body trembling, her phone clutched in her hand like a holy relic. This was it. The cage had shrunk to the size of this small, suffocating room. Brody's veiled threats, her father's escalating paranoia, the ghost of Leo Vancett, had all converged on this single point. Fear was no longer a deterrent. It was a cage she had to break out of, or die in. Her conscience, a flickering candle for weeks, now blazed into a wildfire. It was Clara's face that fueled it. She'd seen a new interview with her online, raw, desperate plea for help, posted on a blog dedicated to missing persons. Clara had bypassed the compromised local media, taking her fight to the court of public opinion. She looked broken, but her voice was strong, filled with a defiant love. "My husband was a good man," she'd said, looking directly into the camera. "He was not perfect, but he was fighting for his life, for our life. Someone out there knows what happened. Someone saw something. Please, I am begging you. Your silence is killing me. Your silence is killing me." The words had pierced Jenna's fear, her apathy, her self-preservation. She couldn't live with that. She couldn't be the person who let Clara's hope die, who let Brody and Abernathy win, With trembling fingers, she unlocked her phone and opened the video file. She had watched it 100 times, but now she looked at it with new eyes, not as a witness, but as an investigator. She had to find something more. Something undeniable. The video was shaky, the audio distorted by wind. In the foreground was her father, his face contorted in a pathetic, drunken rage as he argued with Abernathy. But in the background, on the road, the silent drama unfolded. The yellow jersey, the rusty pickup truck cutting him off, the two men getting out. She zoomed in, pixel by painful pixel. The men's faces were grainy but recognizable to anyone who knew the county. The Miller brothers, low-level thugs, known for doing Abernathy's dirty work, collecting debts, intimidating tenants, making problems disappear. Then she saw it, something she had missed before. As the Miller brothers grabbed Leo and shoved him toward their truck, his body struggling against them, something fell from his jersey pocket. It was small and metallic, and it glinted in the sun for a split second. Before landing in the tall grass by the side of the road, it was his phone. They hadn't seen it. In their haste, in the violence of the moment, they had missed it. Jenna's heart hammered against her ribs. The phone, it could still be there. It was a long shot, a desperate, insane gamble. But it was the only one she had. If she could find it, what might be on it? GPS data, a final text message, a photo. It was a clue, a tangible piece of evidence beyond her own shaky testimony. It was a thread she could pull. The stakes shifted in an instant. This was no longer just about her fear, it was a race against time. Brody and his men had done their perfunctory search of the area, but they wouldn't have been looking for something so small. They had been performing, not investigating. But what if they went back? What if Abernathy sent the Millers to scour the area, to tie up any loose ends? She had to get there first. She waited until she was sure Earl had passed out, his snores, a ragged saw cutting through the floorboards. Then, she slipped out her window, dropping softly onto the porch roof and shimmying down the post. The night was dark and moonless, the air thick and humid. The woods, her childhood playground, felt alien and menacing. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of terror through her. She ran, fueled by a desperate, terrifying hope, her bare feet silent on the dirt path leading to Old Weaver Road. The spot was easy to find, marked in her memory like a scar. The world was eerily quiet, the only sound, the frantic thrumming of her own blood in her ears. She dropped her hands and knees in the damp grass, her fingers searching, sweeping back and forth through the weeds and dirt. It was impossible, a needle in a haystack. She was a fool. She should have stayed in her room, deleted the video, and buried the secret forever. And then, her fingers brushed against something cool. Smooth and rectangular. She pulled it from the grass, her breath catching in her throat. It was Leo's phone. The screen was cracked, but it was intact. She pressed the power button. Nothing. The battery was dead. A wave of despair washed over her. It was useless. Just another piece of dead technology. But then she remembered Leo. The way he was about his gear. Neurotic. He'd told Clara once that he was terrified of being caught in an emergency with a dead phone. He carried a small, portable power bank with him on long rides. Tucked into his jersey pocket, she searched again, her hands more frantic now. And there it was, a few inches away. A small, black plastic rectangle. She fumbled to connect the phone to the power bank, her fingers clumsy with adrenaline. She pressed the power button again. The screen flickered. A logo appeared. And then, the home screen, a picture of Leo and Clara smiling, their arms around each other, a perfect, happy moment, frozen in time. A sob escaped Jenna's lips. The phone was password protected. Of course it was. 6 digits, a million combinations. It was hopeless. She stared at the picture of Clara, her heart aching. What would the password be? A birthday? An anniversary? She tried Clara's birthday. Incorrect. She tried their anniversary, which Clara had mentioned in the blog post. Incorrect. She had one more try before the phone would be disabled for a minute. Her mind raced. What was important to Leo? What had saved him? What was the 6-digit number that represented his salvation? His sobriety date. Clara had talked about it, how proud he was, how he marked it on the calendar every year. It was the day his life had started over. She didn't know the exact date, but Clara did. This was the full conspiracy, the full horrifying picture. It wasn't just Abernathy and the Millers, it was Brodie. Brodie who had deliberately botched the investigation. Brodie who had threatened her into silence. Brodie who was protecting a powerful man for reasons she could only guess at. Maybe Abernathy owned him, held some old debt or secret over his head. Maybe it was about the land, a dispute, something that had escalated into a kidnapping, and, almost certainly, a murder. And they were all in on it together, a web of corruption that had ensnared this entire county. The stakes had just gone nuclear. Her personal pain, her fear, was now connected to a public scandal that could bring down the most powerful men in her world. The tension, already unbearable, cranked to a new, terrifying maximum. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was the fuse. She ran back to the house. The 2 phones clutched in her hand. She had to contact Clara. She couldn't call the police. Brodie was the police. She found the blog post again, found the anonymous tip line Clara had set up, an email address for anyone who knew anything. Her fingers flew across her screen, typing a frantic, anonymous message. I have his phone, I know what happened, they are watching me, meet me tomorrow, noon. The old quarry, off Route 29, come alone. She hit send, her heart pounding a frantic tattoo against her ribs. There was no going back. The clue had surfaced. The conspiracy was laid bare. And now, she had to pray that she could live long enough to see it through. The maximum tension wasn't just about the danger she was in. It was the terrifying, fragile hope that justice was finally within reach. And the knowledge that getting there would mean walking through fire. The old quarry was a gaping wound in the earth. A place of jagged grey rock and unnaturally turquoise water. It was a place of local legend, of teenage dares and ghost stories, abandoned decades ago when the stone ran out. It was the perfect place for a clandestine meeting, isolated and visible from all sides. Jenna had chosen a spot on the highest ridge, a flat granite shelf that gave her a panoramic view of the single dirt road that led in. She lay on her stomach, the hot rock warming her skin, a pair of old, scratched binoculars pressed to her eyes. She had Leo's phone and the power bank in her pocket, the video on her own phone ready to go. The fuse was lit. She just had to wait for the spark. Clara arrived exactly at noon, her small sedan kicking up a plume of dust. She was alone. Jenna watched her get out of the car, a small, determined figure in the vast, empty landscape. She looked lost, vulnerable. But there was a steel in her posture that hadn't been there in the news clips. This was a woman who had been through the fire and come out forged. Jenna took a deep breath and stood up, waving her arm. The meeting was a torrent of pent-up emotion and information. Clara's initial skepticism melted into wide-eyed horror and then a cold, hard fury as Jenna, her voice, trembling but steady, laid out the story. She showed Clara the video. The Miller brothers, Abernathy's truck, and then she handed her Leo's phone. The password, Jenna said, her voice barely a whisper. I think it's his sobriety date. Clara's hands shook as she took the phone. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She looked at the lock screen, at her own smiling face, and then she closed her eyes, as if summoning the date from a sacred place in her memory. She typed in the 6 digits, 08141, 2, August 14, 2012. The phone unlocked. It was all there. A digital ghost of a man's last moments. The app he used to track his rides showed his route, ending abruptly at the exact spot on Old Weaver Road. But that wasn't the bombshell. The bombshell was in his audio recordings. Leo, a man who loved technology, often used a voice memo app to record his thoughts on long rides, ideas for work, reminders for himself. The last recording was not a reminder. It was a confrontation. He had activated it, it seemed, when the truck cut him off. The recording was chaotic, filled with the sounds of a struggle. The grunts of the Miller brothers, Leo's own ragged breaths and defiant curses. And then, a third voice. A voice they both recognized instantly. Its genteel southern accent, a flimsy mask for the menace beneath. Abernathy, you should have stayed in the city. Mr. Vance Abernathy's voice said, calm and cold. You cyclists, you think you own the road, you don't pay attention, you see things you ain't supposed to see. What are you talking about? Leo's voice was strained, terrified but angry. I didn't see anything. There was a pause, and the sound of a car door slamming. Oh, I think you did, Abernathy said. My tenants tell me you've been riding this route for weeks. You ride by that old creek bed. You must have seen our little business venture down there. The one that keeps this county afloat. The one that keeps Sheriff Brody's pockets lined. The conspiracy laid bare in a single arrogant confession. It wasn't about land. It was about something far more lucrative and far more illegal. A drug operation, a meth lab, hidden deep in the woods, financed by Abernathy and protected by Brody. Leo hadn't known what he was seeing, but his repeated presence had made them paranoid. He was a loose end, a risk they couldn't afford. The recording continued, a horrifying document of Leo's final minutes. He had fought, he had pleaded, he had tried to reason with them. And then, there was the sound of a gunshot. A single, sharp crack that echoed in the quarry. A sound from the past that was suddenly, sickeningly present. The recording ended with Abernathy's voice, cold and final. Get rid of him, and the bike. Make it look like he just disappeared. The silence that followed was broken only by a single ragged sob that tore itself from Clara's throat. It was done, the truth was out. It was all there, on that phone. A dead man's final testimony. The why, the who, the how. But exposure wasn't enough. They wanted justice. Public, explosive, undeniable justice. Clara, her face a mask of grief and cold rage, looked at Jenna. What he did to my husband. What they did, it can't be a secret. I don't want a quiet arrest. I want the world to see them for what they are. A plan began to form. A wild, audacious plan, born of shared grief and righteous anger. It wasn't enough to leak the recording to the press. Brody would deny it. Abernathy would hire a team of lawyers to pick it apart. They had to create a moment. A cinematic, inescapable moment of public reckoning. The Buckingham County annual Founders' Day picnic was in 2 days. It was the biggest social event of the year, a day of barbecue, bluegrass music, and patriotic speeches on the lawn of the historic county courthouse. The entire county would be there. The local news would be there, and the guest of honor, the man who would give the keynote address, was Sheriff Al Brody. He would be standing on a stage, a microphone in his hand, the symbol of law and order in his kingdom. It was the perfect stage for a public execution. The plan was terrifyingly simple. Clara, using a prepaid burner phone, would email the audio file to the reporter from the Roanoke station who had been covering the story. The only one who had shown a flicker of skepticism towards Brody's narrative. The email would be timed to arrive 5 minutes before Brody was scheduled to speak. Attached would be a simple instruction. Play this. Loud. Jenna's role was just as crucial. She would be in the crowd, her own phone ready. The moment the audio started playing over the PA system, she would start live streaming, not the stage, but the faces in the crowd. The faces of her neighbors, her friends, the people who had lived under Brody's thumb for decades. She would capture their shock, their dawning horror, their outrage. She would make them witnesses. The payoff had to be cinematic. It had to be a firestorm. They would use Brody's own stage, his own moment of glory, to crucify him. It was a gamble of epic proportions. If it failed, they would be exposed, and the consequences would be swift and brutal. But if it worked, it would be a bombshell that would tear the corrupt heart out of Buckingham County. It was more than justice. It was revenge. A public hanging, carried out not with a rope, but with a dead man's voice. The tension was no longer about fear. It was about the breathless anticipation of the coming explosion. They were no longer victims, they were avengers, and the scene was set for a finale that would burn the old world to the ground. Founders Day dawned, bright and oppressively humid. The sky, a bleached-out, hazy blue. The courthouse lawn was a sea of plaid shirts, sundresses, and red plastic cups. The air smelled of grilled meat, cut grass, and a cloying corporate patriotism. A bluegrass band twanged away on a makeshift stage, their cheerful music a jarring counterpoint to the knot of ice in Jenna's stomach. She moved through the crowd, a ghost in a hoodie, her phone clutched in her sweaty palm. She found a spot near the front, just to the side of the stage, a perfect vantage point. She could see Clara standing near the edge of the crowd, her face pale but resolute, a statue of avenging grief. At precisely 1:55 p.m. The band finished their song to polite applause. The master of ceremonies, a portly local realtor, waddled to the microphone. And now, folks, it's the honor of a lifetime to introduce a man who needs no introduction. A man who has dedicated his life to keeping this county safe. The heart and soul of Buckingham County, Sheriff Al Brody. Brody walked onto the stage to a wave of applause, a king surveying his loyal subjects. He was beaming, his hand raised. In a magnanimous wave, he tapped the microphone, the familiar sound echoing across the lawn. Thank you, he began, his voice dripping with false humility. On this beautiful day, as we celebrate our heritage, our values. He never got to finish the sentence. A high-pitched squeal of feedback erupted from the large speakers flanking the stage, making the crowd wince. Then, silence. A confused murmur rippled through the audience. Brody looked over at the sound tent, with an annoyed frown. And then, it came. You should have stayed in the city, Mr. Vance. Abernathy's voice, cold and clear, boomed across the courthouse lawn. The silence that followed was absolute. Every head turned towards the speakers, confused. Jenna's heart felt like it was going to explode. She raised her phone and hit the Go Live button. Brody froze. The color drained from his face. His folksy smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, panicked disbelief. He looked wildly from the speakers to the sound tent, his eyes wide with dawning horror. You cyclists, you think you own the road. You see things you ain't supposed to see. Leo's voice now, terrified but defiant. What are you talking about? I didn't see anything. Jenna panned her phone across the crowd. She saw faces of confusion turning to shock, jaws dropping, eyes widening. People were looking at each other, whispering, pointing at the stage. At Brody Abernathy's voice again, dripping with arrogant confession. Our little business venture down there. The one that keeps this county afloat. The one that keeps Sheriff Brody's pockets lined. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was a physical sound, a wave of shock and revulsion. All eyes were on Brody now, 1,000 silent accusations. He stood paralyzed, trapped in the spotlight, his face a grotesque canvas of sweat and terror. He looked like an animal caught in the headlights, his folksy persona stripped away to reveal the rotten core beneath. And then, the gunshot. The sound cracked through the festive air like a whip, sharp, ugly, and undeniable. Several people screamed. A woman fainted. The bluegrass band looked on, their instruments clutched in their hands like weapons they didn't know how to use. The recording ended. The silence that fell was the loudest sound Jenna had ever heard. It was a silence thick with judgment, with disgust, with the crumbling of an entire world order. For a long moment, nobody moved. The entire county was a frozen tableau of shock. Then, a single voice from the back of the crowd yelled, "Murderer!" It broke the spell. The crowd erupted. It wasn't a riot. It was something more terrifying. It was a sea of cold, quiet rage. The whispers turned to shouts. Liar, corruption, justice for Leo. People surged forward, not with violence, but with the weight of their collective disillusionment. They weren't a mob. They were a jury. Brody stumbled back from the microphone, his eyes darting around, looking for an escape that wasn't there. He saw two of his deputies at the side of the stage, their faces ashen. He barked an order at them, but they didn't move. They just stared at him, their expressions a mixture of fear and contempt. His power had evaporated in the space of 60 seconds, and then, from the edge of the crowd, to state police, cruisers, their lights flashing but sirens silent, rolled onto the grass. They hadn't come for crowd control, they had been waiting. Clara, working with the Roanoke Reporter, had coordinated with the state attorney general's office. The reporter had played the audio for them that morning. This wasn't just an it was a sting operation. Two state troopers, their faces grim and professional, walked calmly through the parting crowd and mounted the steps of the stage. They walked right past the local deputies, ignoring them completely. One of the troopers took the microphone from the stand. Alvin Brody, his voice boomed, calm and authoritative. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and racketeering." The public arrest was a slow-motion cinematic masterpiece of humiliation. They cuffed Brody on the stage he had claimed as his own, in front of the people he had ruled with fear and folksy charm. Jenna's livestream captured every second of it, the click of the handcuffs, the look of utter, abject defeat on Brody's face as he was led down the steps, his head bowed. The crowd didn't cheer. They watched in a solemn, powerful silence, their faces a mixture of vindication and sorrow. They were watching the death of a lie they had all been forced to live. The camera on Jenna's phone was steady. She was no longer a frightened girl. She was a journalist, a historian, a vessel for the truth. She zoomed in on Brody's face as the troopers pushed him into the back of the cruiser. He looked up, and for a fleeting second, his eyes met the lens of her phone. He saw her, and in his eyes, she saw not hatred, but a flicker of recognition. The quiet girl from the farmhouse, the one he had dismissed, threatened, and underestimated. It was the ultimate poetic justice. He hadn't been brought down by a rival or a state investigator. He'd been brought down by the very people he considered insignificant, a grieving wife and a powerless teenage girl. The cinematic payoff was complete. It wasn't just an arrest. It was an exorcism. And as the state police cruisers pulled away, taking Brody and the dark secret of Buckingham County with them, a cleansing rain began to fall, washing the dust and the blood from the courthouse lawn. The weeks that followed were a blur of headlines, indictments, and confessions. Abernathy was arrested at his sprawling mansion that same afternoon, surrendering without a fight, his arrogance replaced by the quiet pragmatism of a man already negotiating a plea deal. The Miller brothers were picked up in a dingy bar 2 counties over, their thuggish loyalty evaporating the moment they were offered a reduced sentence. The meth lab was discovered, a sprawling, sophisticated operation hidden in a series of caves on Abernathy's land. The corruption ran deep, implicating a county judge, 2 commissioners, and half of Brody's department. Buckingham County was gutted, its rotten core exposed to the harsh light of day. But Leo was still gone. His body was never found. Abernathy, in his confession, claimed the Millers had buried him deep in the woods, in a place they couldn't precisely remember. The search teams went out again, this time with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. But the vast, indifferent wilderness kept it secret. Leo Vance had been erased from the earth. The emotional aftermath was not a celebration. There was no victory parade. There was only a quiet, heavy sense of sorrow and a profound, haunting emptiness. The public justice had been served, but the private wound remained. Raw and unhealing, a memorial service was held for Leo on a cool, overcast day in late autumn. It wasn't in a church. It was on Old Weaver Road, at the spot where his life had been stolen. A small crowd gathered, a mixture of his family, his friends from the city, and the changed people of Buckingham County. They weren't strangers anymore. They were bound together by a shared tragedy and a shared truth. Clara stood before them, her voice clear and strong, not speaking of vengeance, but of love. She spoke of the man who had fought his demons and won, the man who found his salvation on 2 wheels, the man whose goodness had been an inconvenient truth in a world of comfortable lies. Jenna was there, standing at the back of the crowd. She was no longer the girl from the farmhouse. The trial, her testimony, the media storm it, had all forced her into the light. She had been offered a scholarship from a national journalism foundation, a full ride to a university hundreds of miles away. Her father, stripped of Abernathy's protection, and facing his own neglect charges, had faded into the background, a pathetic, powerless ghost. She was free, but she was not unmarked. She looked at the faces in the crowd, at the raw grief on Clara's face, and she felt the heavy weight of her role in it all. She had been the catalyst, the fuse. She had brought the truth to light, but the truth had not brought Leo back. After the service, after everyone had left, a small group of cyclists from Leo's club arrived. They worked in silence, their movements efficient and solemn. They erected a ghost bike, a simple stripped-down road bike, painted a stark, spectral white, its pedals, chain, and handlebars all coated in the same ghostly hue. They chained it to a wooden post at the side of the road, a permanent silent sentinel marking the place where a man had vanished. It was a memorial, but it was also a warning, a tragic reminder of the cost of the truth. The bike stood in stark contrast to the vibrant greens and browns of the landscape. A beautiful, heartbreaking scar on the face of the county. It would be there for years, its white paint slowly chipping. A story whispered among locals, a chilling piece of folklore for a new generation. The story of the cyclist who rode into the sunset and never came back. Jenna stayed long after the others had gone. Long after Clara had placed a single yellow jersey at the base of the ghost bike. She stood there as the sun began to dip below the hills, painting the clouds in the same violent shades of purple and rose as it had on that first day. The world was quieter now. The silence was no longer menacing. It was just empty. A space where a man used to be. The haunting reflection was not of a battle won, but of a profound and irreversible loss. Justice had been served, but it felt like a hollow victory. A powerful man was in prison, a corrupt system was broken, but a good man was still gone. The emotional echo that lingered was not one of catharsis, but of a deep, abiding sadness. It was the bittersweet ache of healing around a wound that would never fully close. It was the knowledge that even when the truth comes out, it can't always make you whole. It can't bring back the dead. All it can do is stand as a witness, like a white bicycle on a lonely country road. A silent, ghostly testament to the life that was lost, and the love that remained.